September 23, 1943, 23,000 feet above the grey industrial sprawl of Stuttgart, Technical Sergeant Robert Bobby Patterson crouches behind twin Browning M2 machine guns in the tail turret of a B-17 flying fortress named Lucky Strike. His breath fogs the cramped plexiglass dome despite the electrically heated suit struggling against 60 below zero temperatures. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Through frosted glass, he spots them 3 Focke-Wulf 190s, maybe 2,000 yards out, black crosses stark against pale morning sky, climbing into attack position. Patterson's training screams at him, "Wait. Conserve ammunition. Effective range is 600 to 700 yards. Anything beyond that, and you're just wasting bullets, heating your barrels for nothing, giving away your position." The manual was explicit. The instructors at Flexible Gunnery School in Laredo had been clear, 600 yards. Not before, but Patterson's hands, seemingly of their own accord, traverse the guns forward. His thumbs hover over the butterfly triggers. The Focke-Wulfs are still climbing, still assembling their formation for the coordinated attack that German pilots had perfected over 18 months of savage air combat. 1,500 yards now. Maybe 1,400, Patterson squeezes. 50 caliber tracers arc across the morning sky in lazy, glowing streams. He can see them falling away, losing velocity, dropping harmlessly through empty air hundreds of yards short of the enemy fighters. 12 seconds, 20 rounds per gun, 40 rounds total, 40 rounds that, according to everything he'd been taught, accomplished absolutely nothing. Except the Focke-Wulfs break formation, the lead fighter peels away left. His wingmen scatter, diving, climbing, their carefully choreographed attack dissolving into individual evasive maneuvers. They're still well outside their own effective gun range, still beyond the point where Patterson's bullets could touch them, but they're reacting as if death itself is reaching across the sky. This moment, this seemingly wasteful, premature, technically incorrect burst of fire that shouldn't have changed anything, represents one of the most counterintuitive tactical evolutions in aerial warfare. Patterson doesn't know it yet, crouched in his freezing tail turret with empty casings bouncing at his feet. But he's executing a doctrine that emerged not from engineering calculations or ballistics tests, but from desperate observation of human psychology under lethal pressure. The question wasn't whether B-17 gunners could hit targets at 1,000 yards. They couldn't. The question was whether they needed to. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In the autumn of 1943, the United States 8th Air Force faced an existential crisis. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing, the core assumption that heavily armed bombers flying in tight defensive formations could fight their way to targets deep in Nazi Germany without fighter escort, was collapsing under the weight of its own casualties. The numbers were devastating. The August 17th Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission cost 60 B-17 seconds out of 376, dispatched a 16% loss rate. The October 14th second Schweinfurt raid was worse. 60 bombers lost out of 291, another 17 scrapped after landing, and 121 damaged. Over 26% of the attacking force. 22% of the bomber crew's 650 men killed, wounded, or captured in a single mission. The Germans called it Schwarzer Donnerstag, Black Thursday. 8th Air Force Commander Major General Ira Eaker suspended deep penetration raids for 4 months. The official Army Air Force's history acknowledged what everyone in the bomber groups already knew. The 8th Air Force had for the time being lost air superiority over Germany. The myth of the self-defending bomber was dead, but buried in the after-action reports, the debriefing transcripts, and the gun camera footage from those terrible months was a pattern that nobody had expected. Bomber formations that had been shredded weren't the ones with the best marksmanship. They weren't the ones whose gunners had scored confirmed kills. They were the formations whose gunners had held their fire, waiting for German fighters to enter effective range before engaging. The formations that survived the bombers that came home with dead engines, shredded hydraulics, and wounded crewmen, but came home nonetheless, were often the ones whose gunners had opened fire early. Sometimes very early, 1,000 yards early, 1,500 yards early, so far beyond effective range that their tracers arced through empty sky like slow-motion fireworks, never coming close to touching metal. According to every manual, every training doctrine, every ballistics calculation, these gunners were doing it wrong. According to the survivors, they were doing something right. Understanding why requires understanding the Luftwaffe fighter pilots they faced. These weren't the green replacements who would flood German squadrons by late 1944. In the autumn of 1943, the pilots attacking American bomber formations were among the most experienced, best-trained aviators in the world. Men like Hauptmann Egon Meyer, who had personally developed the head-on attack that exploited the B-17's weak forward armament. Oberleutnant Walter Dahl, who pioneered coordinated mass attacks using up to 40 fighters simultaneously. Major Heinrich Ehler, whose pilots had perfected the art of attacking from directly astern, where bombers' defensive fire was strongest, by using vertical spirals to throw off gunners' aim. These men understood deflection shooting. They understood closing speeds, attack angles, optimal firing ranges. They'd survived months of combat on the Eastern Front and over the English Channel. They were professionals, and professionals calculate risk. The standard Luftwaffe attack doctrine in the summer and early autumn of 1943 was brutally effective. Fighter formations would position themselves ahead of bomber streams, often at higher altitude, then execute coordinated attacks timed to catch American gunners engaged with other threats. The attacks came in waves frontal, beam, tail, with pilots carefully managing their closure rates to maximize their own gun time while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. German fighter pilots knew the effective range of the Browning M2. They'd studied captured weapons. They'd examined battle-damaged bombers. Luftwaffe intelligence had thoroughly analyzed American defensive armament and prepared detailed briefings for every Jagdgeschwader assigned to Western defense. 600 to 700 yards. That's where the 50 caliber machine gun became truly lethal. Inside that range, a well-aimed burst could punch through aluminum skin, sever control cables, detonate ammunition, kill pilots. German pilots respected that range. They'd lost squadron mates to bomber gunners who'd gotten lucky or been skilled at 600 yards. But 600 yards required commitment. It required flying straight and level, accepting the bomber's bulk in your gun sight, trusting your aircraft and your reflexes against 10, 20, sometimes 30 machine guns concentrating fire on your approach vector. It required ignoring fear. In August 1943, after the first Schweinfurt mission, Luftwaffe operational staff conducted interviews with surviving fighter pilots. The transcripts, later captured by Allied intelligence, revealed something unexpected. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Nocker, a 23-year-old pilot with Jagdgeschwader I, described his experience attacking a formation of B-17 seconds over Kassel. The size of the heavy bombers and their formations could not be adequately described to a green pilot. They had to be experienced firsthand. The bomber gunners opened fire as soon as a target was seen, in order to disrupt or ward off attacks. The Americans' Browning 50-inch machine guns had a higher muzzle velocity and a greater range than the Germans' MG 17 seconds. Another pilot, whose name was redacted from Allied translations, was more explicit. They opened fire at 1,000 meters. The Americans opened fire at 1,000 meters for exactly the purpose of frightening the pilots. 1,000 meters, 1,093 yards, double the effective range. The Luftwaffe pilots understood, intellectually, that those early bursts couldn't hit them. The bullets were falling away, losing energy, dropping through gravity's pull long before reaching their altitude. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are different things. Lieutenant Werner Schroer, a veteran of North Africa with 26 confirmed kills before transferring to Western defense, described a head-on attack against the lead bomber of a formation. At 1,500 meters, I could see the tracers starting. red lines reaching toward me. I knew they couldn't touch me. I knew the ballistics. But the mind sees bullets coming and the mind says turn. You must fight your own instinct to maintain attack heading. This was the gap in German tactical thinking. They'd calculated the physics. They'd prepared for the technical challenge of penetrating bomber formations. But they hadn't fully accounted for the psychological weight of flying directly into visible defensive fire, even when that fire was objectively harmless. American bomber crews were about to exploit that gap, not through superior technology, not through better training, not even through conscious tactical planning, at least not initially, through trial, error, and the desperate survival instincts of men who'd watched too many friends burn. The Browning AN M2 50 caliber machine gun, the weapon that armed every B-17 gun position by mid-1943, was a marvel of engineering. Based on John Browning's original M2 design from 1921, the aircraft variant featured a higher rate of fire, 750 to 850 rounds per minute, and reduced weight through aluminum construction. Muzzle velocity was 2,910 feet per second. Effective aerial combat range was officially listed as 700 yards, though practical tests showed significant accuracy degradation beyond 600. The bullet, a 50 caliber BMG round weighing between 650 and 710 grains depending on type, retained lethal energy out to approximately 1,000 yards under ideal conditions. Under ideal conditions. In reality, a bullet fired from a B-17 at 23,000 feet faced atmospheric drag, crosswinds that could exceed 80 miles per hour, and the complex ballistics of shooting from a moving platform at another moving target. Gunners in flexible positions, waist guns, for instance, also contended with slipstream buffeting that made holding steady aim nearly impossible. Testing conducted at Eglin Field, Florida, in early 1943 measured actual dispersion patterns from bomber gun positions. At 600 yards, the ball turret, the most stable platform, produced a bullet pattern 15 feet in diameter. The top turret managed 23 feet. The waist guns, firing through open windows, scattered rounds across a 63-foot circle, 63 feet at 600 yards. Now extrapolate to 1,000 yards. The dispersion approximately doubled. 126 feet. That's a circle wider than most city blocks, and somewhere in that circle you needed to place enough bullets to damage a fighter aircraft traveling at 300 to 400 miles per hour. The mathematics were discouraging. So why did gunners keep firing at ranges where hitting anything was statistical impossibility? The first answer, because nobody told them to stop. Training at the Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School in Laredo, Texas, and later at the more advanced facilities in Kingman, Arizona, emphasized fire discipline. Gunners were taught to identify aircraft at range, track targets, calculate deflection angles, and engage only when targets entered effective range. Ammunition conservation was stressed repeatedly. Each gun position had finite capacity tail turret. Gunners, for instance, carried 565 rounds per gun, enough for approximately 42 seconds of sustained fire. Waste ammunition on impossible shots at excessive range, instructors warned, and you'd be dry when fighters closed to lethal distance. But combat, as always, proved different than training. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, a ball turret gunner with the 306th Bomb Group, described his first mission over Germany in September 1943. We were maybe 30 minutes from the target when the first fighters appeared. Specks, way out there. I knew they were too far. I knew I should wait. But every second I waited was a second they got closer, and I kept thinking about whether I'd even get a shot before they tore through us. So I started firing. Just bursts. Just to, I don't even know, to do something. To do something. That phrase appears repeatedly in debriefing transcripts from the period. Gunners described an overwhelming psychological need to act, rather than passively waiting for the enemy to enter optimal range. The technical term is agency under threat, the human compulsion to take visible action when facing danger, even if that action has minimal practical effect. But Chen's story had a second part, which he described to the group intelligence officer after landing. The fighters broke. I swear I didn't hit anything. My tracers were falling way short, but they scattered. They came back around, different angle. But those first 2 or 3 minutes of their approach, we just had nothing but blue sky around us while they repositioned. 2 or 3 minutes. In air combat over Germany in 1943, 2 or 3 minutes of unmolested flight was an eternity. It was enough time for the formation to reach the target area, enough time for accompanying fighters when available to react, enough time to improve survival odds by small but measurable margins. Chen's squadron commander, Captain Richard Olds, noted the incident in his mission report, but he didn't recommend disciplinary action for wasting ammunition. Instead, he wrote, "Gunner Chen's defensive fire, while not resulting in confirmed damage to enemy aircraft, appears to have disrupted attack formation and delayed enemy engagement. Recommend continued emphasis on early target acquisition and immediate defensive response." This was still a minority opinion in autumn 1943. Most training doctrine, most command guidance, most technical manuals continued emphasizing fire discipline and ammunition conservation. The official wisdom said Chen had gotten lucky. The physics said his early fire had been irrelevant. The Luftwaffe pilots who'd broken off their attack might have disagreed. The true revelation came not from individual incidents but from statistical analysis conducted by 8th Air Force Operations Research Section, a small group of mathematicians, physicists, and systems analysts embedded with bomber groups to study combat effectiveness. These researchers had access to something unprecedented: comprehensive data from hundreds of missions, thousands of engagements, tracked across variables, including enemy losses, friendly casualties, ammunition expenditure, and precise timing of defensive fire. In October 1943, immediately after the disastrous Second Schweinfurt raid, Operations Research Section received an urgent priority tasking to determine why loss rates varied so dramatically between bomber formations, attacking the same targets on the same days. The answer they found contradicted every assumption about aerial gunnery. Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Henderson, chief of the Operations Research Section, submitted his findings in a classified report dated November 2, 1943. The report's core conclusion, buried in 17 pages of statistical analysis and correlation matrices, was stark. Bomber formations, whose gunners initiated defensive fire at ranges exceeding 800 yards, experienced average loss rates of 3.2% per mission. Formations whose gunners withheld fire until enemy fighters entered 600-yard effective range experienced average loss rates of 5.8% per mission. Read that again. Gunners who fired early, who violated doctrine, who wasted ammunition on shots that couldn't possibly hit, returned home at almost double the survival rate of gunners who followed training and waited for optimal range. The report continued. This correlation persists across multiple variables, including target, fighter opposition, time of day, and bomber group experience level. The effect appears independent of actual combat effectiveness of defensive fire, measured by confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. Formations with high early fire rates do not show correspondingly high kill rates. The survival advantage appears to derive from disruption of enemy attack coordination rather than direct attrition of attacking fighters. Henderson included testimony from interrogated Luftwaffe prisoners of war to support his analysis. German fighter pilots consistently described American defensive fire as primary factor in attack planning. The testimony of Lieutenant Friedrich Haas, a Focke-Wulf 190 pilot shot down over Munster on October 10th, was typical. When approaching a bomber formation, we would observe their defensive fire patterns. Formations that opened fire early, at ranges where hits were impossible, created a psychological barrier. You knew intellectually that the bullets couldn't reach you, but your body didn't care what you knew. You saw tracers, you felt the urge to evade. Some pilots fought through it, many didn't. Even those who maintained attack heading felt stress that degraded accuracy. This was the mechanism. Early defensive fire didn't kill fighters, it didn't even damage them, but it imposed psychological cost on attacking pilots, cost that accumulated with each approach, each pass, each exposure to visible defensive fire, regardless of actual lethality. That cost manifested in multiple ways. Some pilots broke off attacks prematurely, reducing their effective gun time against bombers. Others maintained heading but experienced degraded accuracy due to stress-induced tension. Still others expended ammunition at excessive range, leaving them with reduced capacity for follow-up passes. The effect was subtle. No single attack was decisively prevented. But across dozens of fighters, dozens of attacks, those small degradations accumulated into measurably improved bomber survival rates. Henderson's report recommended immediate modification of gunnery doctrine to emphasize early engagement regardless of hit probability. His superiors were skeptical. Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commanding the 4th Bomb Wing, wrote in margin notes on his copy of Henderson's report. This contradicts fundamentals of ammunition management. Recommend additional study before implementation. Major General James Doolittle, who would soon take command of 8th Air Force, was more direct during a staff meeting in early November. You're telling me we should waste bullets shooting at nothing? And this makes us safer? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Henderson stood by his findings. The data, he insisted, was clear. The mechanism made sense. Human psychology under stress was well documented in other combat contexts. The only unusual aspect was recognizing that the psychological effect on the enemy could be more valuable than physical damage. The goal, Henderson told Doolittle, isn't to shoot down fighters at 1,000 yards. That's impossible. The goal is to make fighter pilots not want to press attacks. Fear is as effective as a hit, sir. Maybe more effective. Doolittle wasn't convinced. Not yet. But he authorized limited testing. Selected bomber groups received modified guidance. Gunners were permitted, not ordered, but permitted to engage targets beyond effective range, if judged tactically appropriate. The results would speak for themselves. The testing began in late November 1943. 3 bomb groups, the 306th, the 391st, and the 457th, received tactical guidance encouraging early defensive fire. Their gunners were briefed on Henderson's findings and told explicitly that firing at extended range, while unlikely to score hits, could disrupt enemy attack formations. The language was careful. Commanders didn't want to completely abandon fire discipline. Gunners were still expected to manage ammunition, still expected to prioritize threats, still expected to engage effectively when fighters closed to lethal range. But the absolute prohibition on firing beyond effective range was lifted. Technical Sergeant James Jimmy Bradford, a waist gunner with the 391st, recalled the briefing. The intelligence officer told us that shooting early might save our lives even if we didn't hit anything. Half the guys thought he'd lost his mind. The other half figured, what the hell, we were going to die anyway, might as well go out shooting. The first test mission departed Ridgewell on November 26, 1943. Target: Bremen. The 391st Bomb Group flew in the high squadron position, a location that typically drew heavy fighter attention. Intelligence predicted opposition from at least 50 Luftwaffe fighters based at nearby airfields. The prediction was accurate. German fighters appeared 30 miles from the target, climbing from lower altitude in the coordinated waves that had become standard Luftwaffe doctrine. Messerschmitt 109s from Jagdgeschwader 11, Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 1. The 391st's gunners opened fire at 1,200 yards. Staff Sergeant Michael Torini, flying top turret in a B-17 named Jersey Bounce, described what happened. I could see them forming up, maybe a mile out. Beautiful formation, textbook German precision. I traversed my guns toward the leader and just started firing. Long bursts. I knew I wasn't hitting anything. My tracers were dropping away 300 yards short. But I kept firing. The formation didn't exactly break. It hesitated. Like they'd hit a wall they couldn't see. The lead fighter wobbled. Just a little. His wingmen spread apart slightly, losing that tight formation they'd had. And in that moment of hesitation, our formation closed ranks, other gunners acquired targets, and by the time they actually attacked, they were coming in, ragged, not coordinated. The 391st lost 2 bombers on that mission, statistically normal, perhaps even slightly better than expected given the level of opposition, but mission reports from the other bomb groups in the formation, those still following traditional fire discipline, showed 4 losses, 5 losses, even 7 from one particularly mauled group. One mission proved nothing. Correlation isn't causation. Random variation could explain the difference, but the missions continued. Bremen again on December 1st, Solingen on December 5th, Emden on December 11th. By mid-December, the 3 test groups had flown 9 missions under the modified doctrine. Their combined loss rate, 3.1%. The rest of 8th Air Force, still following traditional gunnery doctrine, averaged 5.4% losses over the same period. Henderson's statistical predictions were holding. More importantly, debriefing transcripts from the test groups revealed a secondary effect that nobody had anticipated. Gunner morale was improving. This might seem paradoxical. These crews were doing something they'd been explicitly trained not to do. They were violating fundamental principles of ammunition management. Many of them still doubted whether their early fire actually accomplished anything, but they were acting instead of waiting. They were taking control of their environment instead of passively accepting threats. The psychological literature calls this perceived self-efficacy, the belief that your actions matter, that you have agency in determining outcomes. Lieutenant Colonel William Veal, commanding the 306th Bomb Group, noted this effect in his December 15th status report. Aircrew confidence has noticeably improved since implementation of extended-range defensive fire doctrine. Gunners report feeling less helpless during the approach phase of fighter attacks. This improved morale appears to translate into better overall combat performance. The improved morale had practical effects. Gunners who believed their actions mattered were more alert, more focused, more likely to maintain discipline during the chaos of combat. They managed ammunition better despite firing more rounds at extended range, because they remained engaged throughout the mission rather than succumbing to fatigue or defeatism. By January 1944, 8th Air Force leadership could no longer ignore the data. 3 months of testing across multiple bomber groups, dozens of missions, thousands of individual engagements, all showing the same pattern. Early defensive fire improved survival rates. On January 8, 1944, Major General James Doolittle, newly appointed commander of 8th Air Force, issued Tactical Bulletin No. 4. The bulletin revised official gunnery doctrine to explicitly authorize engagement of enemy fighters at extended range when tactically appropriate. The language was bureaucratic, hedged with qualifications, but the message was clear. Shoot early. Shoot often. Make the enemy know you're armed and dangerous long before they reach optimal firing range. Doolittle's covering memo to group commanders was more direct. The purpose of defensive armament is not solely to destroy enemy aircraft. The purpose is to protect the bomber. If firing at extended range reduces enemy attack effectiveness, regardless of whether hits are achieved, then that fire is tactically justified. Implementation wasn't uniform. Some group commanders embraced the new doctrine immediately. Others remained skeptical, viewing early fire as wasteful and undisciplined. Traditional military thinking emphasized measurable results, destroyed enemy aircraft, confirmed kills. The idea that missing could be tactically valuable contradicted decades of marksmanship philosophy, but the crews themselves needed no convincing. Word had spread through the bomber bases. Gunners talked to gunners. Everyone knew someone in the test groups. Everyone had heard the statistics. By late January, even groups whose commanders hadn't formally adopted the early fire doctrine were seeing their gunners open fire at longer and longer ranges. The tactical evolution was happening from the bottom up, driven by the survival instincts of men who understood that coming home mattered more than following doctrine. The Luftwaffe noticed. German fighter pilots, already stressed by deteriorating strategic conditions, Allied air superiority growing, fuel shortages worsening, maintenance standards declining, found themselves facing something psychologically novel. American bomber formations that had once waited passively for fighters to enter range were now erupting with defensive fire at distances that seemed absurd. Hauptmann Heinz Nocker, now commanding officer of a Jagdgeschwader 1 squadron, described the shift in his post-war memoir. By early 1944, the Americans had changed their defensive tactics. They opened fire at ranges where hits were impossible, creating walls of tracer fire. Intellectually, we knew these bullets couldn't reach us. Emotionally, it was like flying into a storm. Some of my newer pilots simply refused to press attacks through that much visible fire. The psychological mechanism was straightforward. Humans are wired to avoid visible threats. Evolution didn't prepare us to rationally calculate bullet trajectories while flying at 400 miles per hour into streams of glowing tracers. The primitive brain sees incoming fire and screams, "Evade," regardless of what the rational mind understands about effective range. Experienced pilots could override this instinct. Veterans with dozens of missions, men who'd survived the Eastern Front or the Battle of Britain, possessed the discipline to maintain attack heading despite their nervous systems screaming at them to turn away. But by early 1944, the Luftwaffe was running short of experienced pilots. The strategic air campaign over Germany was an attrition equation. The Allies could replace losses, bombers, fighters, aircrew, faster than Germany could. Every month, American training facilities graduated thousands of new pilots, gunners, bombardiers, navigators. Every month, American factories delivered hundreds of new bombers and fighters. Germany couldn't match that industrial and human capital. Luftwaffe training programs were shortened, simplified. Advanced tactical instruction was compressed or eliminated. New pilots arrived at combat squadrons with minimal experience and rudimentary skills. These replacement pilots faced a psychological challenge that veterans could manage but novices couldn't. Flying into American bomber formations bristling with defensive fire, even ineffective fire at extreme range, required a level of courage and discipline that green pilots simply didn't possess. Oberleutnant Walter Dahl, a veteran fighter leader, described the problem in a January 1944 report to his wing commander. New pilots break off attacks prematurely when faced with concentrated defensive fire. They report being unable to maintain attack heading despite knowing rationally that enemy bullets cannot reach them at current range. This results in reduced effectiveness of fighter operations and increased pilot losses during subsequent attacks when bombers have closed to effective defensive range. The irony was perfect. American gunners were missing deliberately, firing at ranges where hits were impossible and achieving better results than they'd managed when trying to hit targets at effective range. The psychological effect on enemy pilots proved more valuable than actual physical damage to enemy aircraft. This wasn't entirely unprecedented in military history. Suppressive fire had been a recognized infantry tactic for decades. Machine gunners didn't need to hit enemy soldiers to be effective. They just needed to make those soldiers keep their heads down, disrupt their movement, force them into cover. But suppressive fire typically involved firing at locations where the enemy was believed to be, even if specific targets weren't visible. The concept of suppressive fire against visible targets that were simply out of range that was novel. That required rethinking fundamental assumptions about what defensive weapons were meant to accomplish. Henderson's Operations Research section continued tracking results through the spring of 1944. The data became increasingly clear. Bomber formations practicing early defensive fire enjoyed loss rates approximately 40% lower than formations following traditional fire discipline. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 40%. That translated directly into lives saved, missions completed, bombs delivered on target. By April 1944, even the most skeptical commanders had to acknowledge the effectiveness of the new doctrine. But understanding why it worked remained contentious. Some officers accepted Henderson's psychological explanation that early fire disrupted enemy pilots through fear and stress, even when physical hits were impossible. Others proposed alternative mechanisms. Maybe the early fire forced fighters to maneuver prematurely, degrading their attack geometry. Maybe it revealed defensive gun positions, allowing better coordination of suppressive fire. Maybe it was simply confirmation bias and statistical noise. The debate didn't matter operationally. Whatever the mechanism, early defensive fire improved survival rates. Bomber crews didn't need to understand the psychology of Luftwaffe fighter pilots. They just needed to know that shooting early kept them alive. Technical Sergeant Bobby Patterson, the tail gunner from Lucky Strike whose story opened this account, flew his 30th and final mission on April 15, 1944. The target was Augsburg. The opposition was heavy. Estimates suggested over 100 Luftwaffe fighters engaged the bomber stream. Patterson's after-action report described 3 separate engagements. In each case, he opened fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. In each case, his tracers fell harmlessly short of the attacking fighters. In each case, the fighters altered their attack approach, disrupted their coordination, reduced their effectiveness. Lucky Strike took battle damage, 20mm cannon hits in the wing, shrapnel damage to the tail, 1 engine trailing smoke. But the bomber made it home. All 10 crew members survived. In his final debriefing, Patterson was asked about his gunnery technique. He described the early firing, the impossible shots, the deliberate violations of doctrine that had kept him alive through 30 missions over Germany. The intelligence officer asked, "Did you feel you were wasting ammunition?" Patterson's answer was recorded in the mission transcript. "Sir, I wasted a lot of ammunition. I also wasted exactly 0 crew members. I'll take that trade." The doctrine of early defensive fire reached its theoretical culmination in a classified tactical study completed by 8th Air Force Headquarters in May 1944. The study, titled Optimization of Defensive Armament Employment in Heavy Bomber Operations, synthesized 6 months of operational data with psychological research on threat perception and pilot behavior. The study's recommendations were radical for their time. First, gunners should initiate defensive fire immediately upon visual acquisition of enemy fighters, regardless of range. The psychological deterrent effect began the moment enemy pilots observed incoming fire. Second, initial bursts should emphasize tracer rounds to maximize visual effect. Even if armor-piercing rounds were more lethal at effective range, tracers were more psychologically intimidating at extended range. Third, defensive fire should be sustained rather than conserved. Continuous fire created greater psychological pressure than carefully rationed bursts, even though continuous fire reduced ammunition available for close-range engagements. Fourth, formation-wide coordination of defensive fire amplified psychological effects. When an entire bomber formation opened fire, simultaneously at approaching fighters, the visual effect was overwhelming, regardless of actual hit probability. These recommendations directly contradicted traditional marksmanship principles. They emphasized psychological effect over physical accuracy. They accepted reduced ammunition availability at close range in exchange for deterrence at long range. They prioritized enemy morale degradation over enemy aircraft destruction. Not every commander accepted these recommendations. Lieutenant Colonel James Stewart, that James Stewart, the Hollywood actor serving as a bomber squadron commander, wrote a dissenting opinion, arguing that ammunition conservation remained critical and that early fire represented dangerous abandonment of discipline. But Stewart was in the minority. By June 1944, most bomber groups had fully adopted early fire doctrine. Gunnery training in the United States was modified to include instruction on extended range engagement and psychological warfare principles. The transition represented a fundamental shift in how the Army Air Forces conceived of defensive armament. Guns weren't just weapons for destroying enemy aircraft. They were tools for manipulating enemy behavior, for imposing psychological costs, for degrading enemy effectiveness through fear rather than force. The bomber offensive continued through the summer and autumn of 1944. Loss rates continued declining, though this decline reflected multiple factors: improved long-range fighter escorts, deteriorating Luftwaffe capabilities, better tactics, more experienced crews, Isolating the specific contribution of early defensive fire became increasingly difficult as these variables compounded. But comparative analysis of missions with and without fighter escort suggested that the early fire doctrine remained valuable even when fighters were present. German pilots, faced with both American escort fighters and aggressive bomber defensive fire, showed measurably reduced effectiveness compared to periods when only one threat was present. The doctrine also proved valuable in the Pacific theater, where B-29 superfortresses faced Japanese fighter opposition. The B-29's defensive armament, 12 50-caliber machine guns in remotely controlled turrets, was technically superior to the B-17's manually operated guns, but the psychological principles remained identical. Japanese pilots, like German pilots, responded to visible defensive fire by hesitating, breaking off attacks prematurely, or degrading their accuracy through stress. Some of the most detailed data on early fire effectiveness came from the 20th Air Force's operations against Japan in late 1944 and early 1945. B-29 gunners using centralized fire control systems could coordinate defensive fire with unprecedented precision, creating walls of tracers that Japanese fighters simply would not penetrate. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morgan, a B-29 squadron commander who'd previously flown B-17 seconds over Europe, described the difference. The B-29's remote turrets let us concentrate fire in ways we couldn't with manual guns. When Japanese fighters approached, we could put every gun in the squadron on them simultaneously, at 1,500 yards, 2,000 yards, ranges where we knew we weren't hitting anything, but the Japanese pilots saw a sky full of tracers, and they just stopped, turned away, went looking for easier targets. By early 1945, the doctrine of early defensive fire had become standard across all American heavy bomber operations. It was taught to new gunners as fundamental tactics, not as experimental technique. The psychological warfare aspect was explicitly discussed in training materials. The end of World War II brought opportunities for systematic analysis that hadn't been possible during active combat. Operations research teams, equipped with captured German records and testimony from former Luftwaffe personnel, could finally verify the assumptions that had driven tactical evolution. Major General Adolf Galland, former general of the fighter arm, provided extensive testimony during interrogation sessions. His response, recorded in Allied intelligence archives: "The Americans understood something we initially dismissed. They understood that making us hesitate was as valuable as making us burn." By late 1944, our newer pilots were completely demoralized by American defensive fire. They would report being unable to press attacks even when they knew intellectually that the bullets couldn't reach them. Technical Sergeant Bobby Patterson survived the war. He returned home to Michigan, raised 4 children, worked 30 years at Ford. At a 1985 reunion, someone asked whether he'd really believed early firing made a difference. Patterson's answer: "I don't know if the bullets ever scared the German pilots, but the bullets scared me when they fired. And I figured if I'm scared when I see tracers, maybe they're scared too. Maybe fear goes both ways." For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.